On the 13th of July, 1886, the body of Ludwig II, the so-called Mad King of Bavaria, was found floating in 2 feet of water on Lake Starnberg.
The timing is everything, that he was forcibly removed from Neuschwanstein. Within 24 hours, he was in the castle of Berg and he was dead.
The official verdict given by the authorities was suicide by drowning. But the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death and the strange events that took place in the lead-up to it have led many to believe it was no suicide and that he was in fact killed by his own government, who have covered up his murder for over 100 years.
There is a theory that he was actually involved in an escape attempt.
There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there that are outlandish and strange, but I think that the death of King Ludwig, to my mind, certainly looks like it could have been a murder. And I find it very strange that we still can't see the bones of King Ludwig, because I think they'll probably show that Ludwig was shot.
It's one of the most enduring mysteries in German history. A king loved by his people, but hated by his government. The death of King Ludwig II of Bavaria has been the subject of intrigue and investigation for over a century. How did a king, once famous for his eccentric behavior and fairy tale castles, end up being declared insane, removed from his throne, and come to be found floating face down in shallow water near the shores of a remote lake? Was his death the tragic result of suicide, or, as many now believe, the murder of a crowned monarch? Today, King Ludwig II of Bavaria is responsible for some of the most famous and important landmarks in Germany. These castles and monuments bring in billions of euros worth of tourism to the country each year. But they are also the reason for Ludwig's downfall. Born in Munich in 1845, Ludwig was the eldest son of Maximilian II of Bavaria and his wife, Princess Marie of Prussia. From the outset, Ludwig was constantly reminded of his royal duties to come. Knowing his son would one day be king, Maximilian put him into a strict regime of study and tutoring in the hope of molding him into a strong and capable ruler.
He was certainly being prepared from a very early age to take up the mantle of king. And he was certainly drilled and regimented. He would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to do homework and study. His whole day would be timetabled out right up until 8, 9 o'clock at night, by which time he had free time. But the rest of the time it would be spent in language, it would be spent in exercise, it would be spent in learning Latin and mathematics. So he was already being groomed, for want of a better word, for the moment when he would ascend to the throne, which happened a lot earlier than anyone was expecting.
In the time Ludwig was a child, all the people around him were talking about his special behavior, because he wanted to be alone, he wanted to read books, he wanted to sit alone in the mountains or nearby the castle Hohenschwangau.
His childhood home was Castle Hohenschwangau, near the town of Fussen in modern-day Germany. Here, he would enjoy spending his time reading poetry, and discovering his love of classical music and opera. Even as a child, he would lock himself away from the outside world, a habit that would go on to be the main cause of his troubles in later life. John Whetstone is a historian of Bavarian culture, specializing in the life of King Ludwig II.
He read a great deal and spent a lot of time more or less creating a world which he wanted to live in. World of romantic stories. They're old legends. And all these particular stories and myths are things that were deeply embedded in Ludwig.
He was fascinated of German legends and fames from the Middle Ages, Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, die Nibelungen.
For example, he loved the mountains. He loved walking in the mountains. He loved sleigh rides at night. He loved the open air. He loved the scenery of Bavaria. He loved the peasants and the farmers. He felt very much at home in this world.
He was raised to be king from the beginning. He had absolutely no choice. And I believe he knew that it was a matter of time before he would become king.
Ludwig was a very effete figure. He cut a very romantic air, and in fact, he would have been a far better poet or painter or musician, an artist, rather than a king.
After a brief and unexpected illness, his father, Maximilian II, died in March of 1864. Ludwig, who had just turned 18, was crowned King of Bavaria shortly afterwards.
I'm not sure that he wanted to be king in the sense of it was a dream realized. I think he was born to be king. He saw it as his destiny, and he took that destiny very seriously indeed. His model for being a king was Louis XIV, and he was intrigued by the fact that Louis is the French version of Ludwig. And so for him, the absolute monarch, the one who ruled by divine right, the one who says, I am the state, l'état c'est moi, that was the king Ludwig wanted to be.
I think like any flamboyant character, ostensibly flamboyant character, King Ludwig was actually incredibly shy, a very solitary man, a very insecure man.
I think probably above all else, he really enjoyed the pleasures of solitude. I think he liked being alone with his thoughts, with literature. He would read all night.
As King of Bavaria, he had become a monarch at a time when kings were going seriously out of fashion. And so he sees the role of monarch as being something he literally has to play. So when he goes out in public, he kind of adopts this what he thinks is a very regal walk in which he sort of pushes one foot forward and the other foot forward. And of course, behind his back, all his subjects are kind of laughing at him because he looks a bit preposterous.
He was described by the French poet Paul Verlaine as the last true king of Europe, and I think to an extent that is accurate. He was certainly the last true king of Bavaria as it had existed for a large part of the 19th century.
One of Ludwig's first acts as king was to summon the man whose work had inspired him during childhood, the German composer Richard Wagner.
Ludwig had a lot of pet projects, and probably his most enduring pet project came in the form of Wagner, the composer Richard Wagner. And Wagner was a man who would spend a lot of money. He was often poor, impecunious, and desperately in need of assistance. And Ludwig saw Wagner and went, this man's music talks to me. I am the embodiment of the true Bavaria. And this whole mythological idea of the mountains and the forests and this great Teutonic myth is both encapsulated in Wagner's music and indeed in me, Ludwig. So it's a brilliant cultural fit for the two men.
The works of Richard Wagner would go on to become one of the foremost sources of inspiration for Ludwig's future construction projects. The same construction projects that would eventually prove to be his downfall.
And they became very intimate, but I think it was more of an avuncular relationship. In a way, King Ludwig was Wagner's muse. You know, the Ring Cycle would not have been written without King Ludwig of Bavaria.
Wagner himself, when the Ring Cycle of operas is completed, actually says this would not have been possible without Ludwig II. When it was first performed, he made a speech at the front of the stage acknowledging Ludwig II as being not just the patron that made this possible, but I think also the kind of, he gave him the space, he gave him the freedom to create these great works.
But while Ludwig paid close attention to building his cultural and artistic legacy, the Bavarian government were growing increasingly frustrated by his disinterest in the running of the country. They thought that marriage may settle the errant king, and also provide an heir to the throne for the continuation of the dynasty. But finding a match wouldn't be easy.
For all his charisma, I think he was profoundly reticent, profoundly shy. I think the role of the king weighed heavily upon him, so he was very formal, even with close friends. So I think it was very difficult for him to have emotional, physical relationships with anyone.
Es besteht kein Zweifel, dass der König homosexuell war. Und hat diese Homosexualität verborgen, versteckt, im Geheimen versucht auszuleben. Und hat jahrzehntelang dagegen gekämpft. Hat gebetet zu Gott. Es gibt Tagebucheintragungen. Aber zum Schluss, am Ende des Alters, bricht es aus ihm heraus.
There's a part of his life during his adolescence where I believe he was heterosexual. And towards the end of his life, he tended to have more attraction towards men because it was less complicated as friendship.
It was soon noticed that Ludwig was not going to be a conventional monarch. He paid little attention to the usual mundane matters of government. Instead, he would seek ever more creative ways to fulfill his interests.
Ludwig was an absolute expert at amusing himself over a wide range of activities. He would get actors to recite poetry to him all the time. He loved the theatre. He devoured plays and would quite often have them performed privately for him. His single biggest expenditure, and certainly the one that undid him in the end, was the huge amounts of money that he poured into his castles.
Ludwig had become obsessed with the idea of building a fantasy world around him, a world that separated him from his people and kept out the government he had come to loathe. Could it have been this decision to shut himself away that would later lead to his downfall?
Well, I don't think any other king in Europe in the late 19th century built as many palaces as King Ludwig. It was quite extraordinary.
I think that once it became clear to him that his role as a king was going to be quite heavily circumscribed by politics and by statecraft, he moved more and more into the worlds of architecture and building, particularly creating these amazing dream palaces, these castles, where he wished to spend most of his time.
He had very little interest in government or in his people, for that matter, and his obsessions were channeled into building these fantastical series of palaces.
There's Linderhof, which is like a smaller, Baroque palace nestling in the Bavarian countryside, and then there's Herrenchiemsee, this huge tribute to the Versailles of Louis XIV. He poured massive amounts of money into these projects and became increasingly criticized for, first of all, spending all that money on them, secondly, spending all that time there or around them or supervising them rather than looking after the affairs of his people.
Probably his most famous architectural endeavor was Neuschwanstein Castle. Nestled on a rugged hilltop in the Schwangau region of Germany, it's a living testament to his artistic, extravagant, and expensive taste.
Well, Neuschwanstein Castle was an homage to Wagner and to the Grail legends and the medieval era. It was so fantastical that Walt Disney based the Sleeping Beauty castle on Neuschwanstein.
He definitely lived out his dream in Neuschwanstein Castle. He was totally in love with what he built in Neuschwanstein.
The dramatic design was inspired by the operatic works of his friend Richard Wagner. Ludwig even employed his set designer as one of the architects. It took thousands of tons of building material and over 300 craftsmen working around the clock to try and complete it by the deadline, 30 of whom lost their lives in the process. But all of this came at a huge expense.
He wasn't interested in what anything cost. So, and this definitely had an effect on his life because the other members of the family couldn't stand seeing every penny of the family fortune literally thrown out of the window, as they say.
Ludwig's uncle, Luitpold von Bayern, had spent years begrudgingly standing in for his nephew at official state occasions, while Ludwig spent his time plundering the family wealth. Could it be this continued frustration that would later lead to his involvement in a plot against the errant king?
Well, King Ludwig initially funded his building projects, his palaces, with sovereign wealth, but when that was exhausted, he turned to moneylenders in Europe. And when that was exhausted, it became very problematic.
By 1885, Bavaria was on the brink of a financial fallout. And Ludwig had managed to amount a debt of over 14 million marks, nearly 350 million euros in today's money.
The Bavarian government are getting increasingly concerned about Ludwig's expenditure, and they're realizing that it's out of control. I mean, castles cost a lot of money to build. They're not cheap building projects.
The Bavarian Prime Minister, Johann von Lutz, urged Ludwig to economize. But rather than curb his spending, Ludwig made plans for even more elaborate and decorative construction projects. When von Lutz demanded he cease with any further building work, Ludwig threatened to dismiss the entire government.
Ludwig would quite often be very capricious about his ministers and would often fire them for, shall we say, the flimsiest of pretexts, even if they'd served him faithfully. I think you ran a great risk of saying no to Ludwig.
You are now running into serious open hostility between the royal household and the political world, and these two are going to keep clashing.
Under the law of the Bavarian Constitution, the king had the right to fire his ministers and install a new government of his choosing. But there was also another law. If it could be proven that the king was not mentally fit to rule, he too could be removed from power.
Both the Bavarian government and Ludwig have an ace up their sleeve. Now, the Bavarian government's ace is the ability, if they can get Ludwig declared mad, they can depose him. However, Ludwig too has an ace, and he has the power to get rid of the government. Now, that's obviously not something you can do lightly. He knows he can't just play it straight away. So it's now going to be a case of who's going to blink first. Is it the government or is it Ludwig?
In fear of losing their positions, the government decided to act first. Von Lutz hatched a plot to have Ludwig declared mentally ill and removed from the throne. To replace Ludwig, he made a deal with his uncle, Luitpold, who he promised to declare Prince Regent of Bavaria so long as he went along with the plan. But having a king declared insane is no simple task. He would need help. Dr. Bernhard von Gudden was one of the most respected psychologists in Germany during the late 19th century. He had also treated members of Ludwig's family in the past.
Dr. Gudden was a pioneer in psychiatry, and he'd been brought in to assess King Ludwig's brother, Prince Otto, who he actually did declare insane. Dr. Gudden was asked by the government, by Lutz, to assess King Ludwig.
He was recruited by a combination of the parliament and the family to make a decision on Ludwig's stability or instability to rule as king.
Lutz decides to play his ace first, and he says, listen, you have got to assemble as much data as you can in order to give me a report that shows that Ludwig is definitely mad, and therefore I can depose him.
But Gudden had a problem. How could he diagnose Ludwig without alerting him to the plot? Here at the Bavarian State Archives in Munich, they hold a vast collection of papers relating to the life of King Ludwig. Director of the archives, Dr. Gerhard Immler, has spent many years studying the collection, which also includes Dr. Gudden's psychological report.
Here we have the medical report written by Dr. von Gudden and signed by 3 other doctors of medicine, which states that the king is mentally ill. The report certainly states a lot of facts which describe very eccentric, strange, or even silly behavior by the king. For example, when a servant needs to go to the king, he is not allowed simply to go through the door or to knock at the door, but he has to scratch at the door. He is not allowed to speak anything. He has to try to make himself understandable by signs with his hands. And when the servants serve the king his meals, they are not allowed to look at the king, but also not to look at the meal. Dr. von Gudden thought that they are all proof of the king suffering of a certain mental illness, which at that time was called paranoia.
But how could Gudden diagnose Ludwig with such a serious condition without even meeting him?
All this stuff has to be done remotely, it has to be done through hearsay, it has to be done with interviews carried out in secret, and therefore it's not probably the most reliable form of psychiatric evaluation one might hope for.
Gudden legitimated this method of compiling a medical report without seeing the patient by the fact that the king lived an extremely recluse life. Naturally, there are a lot of symptoms which are correctly described as very eccentric behavior, and therefore modern psychiatrists say that, well, it was not paranoia, it was not paranoid schizophrenia, but the king really suffered from a quite severe personality disorder.
He had given the government the ammunition they needed to have Ludwig declared insane. But was Gooden's report fair and unbiased? Was Ludwig actually mentally ill?
Es gibt verschiedene Meinungen. Die einen sagen, er war verrückt im Sinne einer Paranoia. Das haben die Mediziner festgestellt, 1886. Aber heute neigt man eher dazu, zu sagen, der König war seelisch gestört, nicht geistesgestört.
I think that Ludwig was eccentric. I think that his behaviour was well within the realms of acceptable human behaviour. I think that he was just a somewhat unusual figure. But, you know, being unusual does not see you condemned to an insane asylum. Actually, you know, he was a perfectly normal, romantic, effete, slightly Johnny Head-in-air figure. He wasn't mad.
Ludwig clearly did not think he was insane when he was taken into custody. But one of the things that his supporters were frustrated with is that he was not really coming up with a plan to defend himself. I think he was a little bit frozen in indecision.
Some people have claimed that his lack of action was a sign of his mental instability. But a recently discovered letter now in the possession of the Bavarian State Archives is said to be the last letter ever written by Ludwig. It shows that far from him being indifferent to the situation, Ludwig was well aware of the plot and was actively trying to stop it.
About 1 year ago, this archive was able to acquire Ludwig's probably last letter he wrote in his life. We have it here. He wrote this letter to his cousin, Prince Ludwig Ferdinand, to whom he had a quite friendly relationship. Zwingen nach Linderhof zu fahren, offenbar mich dort gefangen zu halten.
Most beloved cousin, forgive the bad scripture, I am writing this in haste. Today, I found myself confronted by two of my ministers who tried to obtain my abdication. This is a most disreputable conspiracy. Who is behind this, I don't know, but I presume it to be Prince Luitpold. Keep all of this temporarily to yourself, but please endeavour to find out what you can from the people you trust. I have heard the rumours of my sickness. These are falsities, solicited from people by way of payment, and not one word is true. We must shine a light on this. With rock-solid trust and deep love, your cousin, Ludwig.
He asks him to explore the situation in Munich and to inform him who else is a member of the conspiracy the king perceives which is going on against him. So this letter shows that when the king wrote it, he was in a quite clear state of mind.
But help never came. After a short standoff, Ludwig gave himself up to the government and was taken into custody. As per his agreement with the government, Luitpold was made Prince Regent to rule in his nephew's absence.
Ludwig was shocked. He staggered. He nearly fainted. He thought that this moment was still a long way off. He thought he still had cards to play.
He allows himself to be detained and arrested, and he knows that his monarchy is effectively over. I mean, this must be just an absolutely tragic moment for him. When he's in effective captivity, he is treated with respect, but he must be internally going through hell.
Ludwig was taken to Castleberg on the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria. There he was to meet with Dr. Gooden, who had been appointed by the government to be the king's personal physician.
The official course of events is very straightforward. Both Gooden and Ludwig decide after dinner, like a couple of gentlemen, they want to take the air and have a bit of a constitutional along the shores of Lake Starnberg.
King Ludwig II and Dr. Gooden came through this gate at about 6:35 in the evening and walked along this path.
What happens next? Again, on the surface, seems very simple. These two men, after some hours, still haven't returned. And naturally, back at the Schloss, there's a lot of concern.
The personnel at Castleberg immediately started a search party. They came down this path looking for them. Their search efforts were frustrated by the fact that it was raining that night, windy, stormy, and it took several hours until one of the members of the search party decided to search the shoreline.
They find two bodies floating face down in the lake. They're fished out, and one of them, to their horror, is Gooden, but to even greater horror, the other is Ludwig.
For over 100 years, debate has raged about exactly what had happened on that fateful walk along the lake, with many suspecting that Ludwig had been the victim of foul play.
I think when we're assessing King Ludwig's death, the timing is everything, that he was forcibly removed from Neuschwanstein. Within 24 hours, he was in the castle of Berg and he was dead.
To my mind, it's incredibly strange that two perfectly healthy grown men can go for a walk along a lake after supper and yet end up face down, dead, drowned.
The official verdict released by the government concluded that Ludwig had committed suicide by drowning.
What is certain is that Ludwig had somehow thrown off his coat and jacket at the same time, so he'd actually done it in one gesture. And there were certainly signs on von Gooden that he had been in some kind of physical struggle. His hands were scratched, and I think a nail was missing.
Actually, this is the first place where there were signs of a struggle between Ludwig and Dr. Gooden. After the bodies were recovered, the physicians discovered that Dr. Gooden was missing half a fingernail. They later discovered that half a fingernail in Ludwig's overcoat. Apparently what happened here is that Ludwig dashed and Gooden tried to grab him, and in the struggle, lost part of the fingernail.
One theory is that Ludwig, now genuinely maddened by the fact he's lost his power and his status, gets into a fight with Gooden on the sides of the lake, and during the struggle, perhaps drowns Gooden and then drowns himself, or perhaps even the other way around. And that is what the official inquiry will suggest.
What interpretation is put on that is another matter. For example, they both drowned, and yet they were found floating in water that was really not deep enough for a grown man.
I am suspicious of the official government theory. And one reason has to do with the dry drowning theory.
One of the most contentious issues about the case concerns the fact that Ludwig was found floating on the surface of the lake, which some believe indicates that his lungs had not filled up with water prior to his death. This is something that is usually confirmed in the autopsy report.
Concerning the king's death, we have an autopsy report here. First, we have an introduction, a short so-called protocol, signed by 3 people, by the Lord Chamberlain, by the Minister of the Royal House and Foreign Affairs, and by a secretary of that ministry. The doctors don't say anything explicitly about the cause of the king's death, but they describe his mortal remains as the corpse of a man who had drowned in water. Dr. von Ziemßen, who wrote the report, didn't say anything explicitly about water in the lungs.
Some people believe that the autopsy report, which was commissioned by the government, may have left out vital information pertaining to the real cause of Ludwig's death. John Wright is a forensic consultant with a specialist interest in historical cold cases.
Normally, when we breathe, our lungs are full of air. And obviously, if we enter a lake and we drown, our lungs become full of water. I'll demonstrate that. A balloon full of air symbolises a lung full of air. If we place it in the water, it floats. When we drown, and our lungs are filled with water, and the two large air sacs that we have in our body become dead weights. The balloon full of water sinks slowly to the bottom.
So if Ludwig didn't die from drowning, what exactly did happen? Many people believe that both the government and Prince Luitpold had no intention of ever letting Ludwig leave his confinement, as they feared that if he could prove that he was not insane, then they would be put on trial for treason.
There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there that are outlandish and strange, but I think that the death of King Ludwig, to my mind, certainly looks like it could have been a murder. And I find it very strange that we still can't see the bones of King Ludwig, because I think they'll probably show that Ludwig was shot.
There was a fisherman living in the town of Berg here, on the other side of the Castle Berg. And there is a theory that he was actually involved in an escape attempt.
Jakob Liddell was Ludwig's personal fisherman working on Lake Starnberg. He is alleged to have left behind a written account of what happened that day.
After Ludwig's death, he never talked about what happened that night. There's some evidence that Jakob Liddell confided in his diary, and he wrote that he was waiting in a boat for King Ludwig, and as Ludwig approached his boat and was climbing in, was shot in the back by the armed guards.
The autopsy doesn't show any gunshot wounds, but the autopsy was commissioned by the government, which could have been the same body that would have shot King Ludwig. So of course they're not going to find proof of their own foul doing.
In 2007, the Bavarian art historian Siegfried Wichmann came forward with a sketch by the 19th century German artist Hermann Kaulbach. Wichmann claimed that the subject of the drawing was none other than King Ludwig himself, and it was made just moments after his death. Interestingly, it appears to show blood oozing from the subject's mouth.
If this is a picture of Ludwig, and this is blood, this could very well indicate internal injury or internal trauma. However, this may well be another individual. It's very unreliable evidence, and these shadows could be anything from pencil marks to shadows on the drawing.
Many experts disagree on whether the person depicted in the sketch really is King Ludwig. And with little known about its origins, it is hardly solid proof. Professor Wilhelm Liebhardt from the University of Augsburg is one of the leading authorities on King Ludwig II. He has a theory that instead of the king being the victim, he was in fact the murderer.
Wollte tatsächlich fliehen, aber Dr. Gutten will ihn festhalten, zieht an ihm. Festhalten.
Professor Liebhardt believes that a struggle broke out as Dr. Gooden tried to prevent Ludwig from escaping. But things turned violent, and in a fit of rage, Ludwig killed the man who had caused him to be removed from his throne. Horrified at what he had done, Ludwig decided not to flee. Instead, he walked out into the lake and took his own life.
Er hat einen Menschen getötet. He murdered. He was a murderer.
Should we simply accept the official verdict given by the government? With so much conflicting information and so many unknowns, will we ever really know what happened that day by the lake? Or will Ludwig remain in death, much as he did in life, a mystery?
I doubt that we will ever find out what happened to him. And that's why I think this is Germany's greatest unsolved mystery.
King Ludwig's an enigma because we simply don't know enough about him. And he died too young, I suppose. I think anybody who's a figure of fascination to the population, be it Marilyn Monroe or King Ludwig of Bavaria, will attract conspiracy theories. I suppose that might explain why people say that, you know, the autopsy on King Ludwig is incorrect or it had been doctored.
Die Quellen sind deshalb verschwunden, wenn es welche gegeben hätte, weil sie würden ja irgendjemand belasten. Sie würden die Minister belasten, sie würden die Familie belasten, sie würden den Psychiater belasten. Solche Dinge räumt man weg.
This subject for the Bavarian government, for the royal family, this subject is closed. They're definitely not interested in any in reopening this situation.
It's a drama. It's an opera in itself. And who wouldn't want to be the star of that? Certainly Ludwig would have loved it.
If you accept it's implausible that two middle-aged men can walk along a lake and end up dead after an hour, then you're going to have to accept the fact there would have been a cover-up. And the only way we can get to the bottom of it is to have a look at Ludwig's bones. And if there's any gunshot wounds on his bones, then that will suggest that the report was a cover-up. But until we can do that, it's always going to be a mystery.
I personally believe that the mystery is far more interesting and far more in line, in keeping with Ludwig's life than any kind of solution. He was a mystery. He was about poetry and romance and drama, and you can't get more poetic or more romantic or dramatic than dying in such strange circumstances.